I'm Sarah Duggin, St. John's Associate Rector. It's good to be here with you this morning to share a few reflections on today's scriptural passages. Oh God, may these words and the meditations of our heart be acceptable to you and useful to your purposes of grace. Amen. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. It's hard to imagine words much more heartrending than these. How could the God of love speak these words? What kind of God would ask a father to sacrifice his own son? Is there anyone who doesn't find this story deeply disturbing? On the surface, the passage is about a cruel test of faith. But there are other ways to look at it. Some biblical scholars view the story of Abraham and Isaac as foreshadowing God's sacrifice of his own son on the cross. Others remind us that Abraham lived in a world where human sacrifice, even the sacrifice of children, was commonly viewed as a necessary means of appeasing angry gods. By these lights, the key to the story is not that Abraham thought he needed to sacrifice Isaac, but that God sent an angel to save Isaac's life and demonstrate once and for all that the one true God does not demand human sacrifice. Nevertheless, the story remains one of the Bible's most troubling tales. And maybe that's the real point, that there is nothing more horrific than taking the life of another human being, especially a child, in the name of God. Of course, we might say, who could quarrel with that? Yet how often have we tolerated the sacrifice of other people's children? And in a way, isn't that what racism and injustice are really all about? As a nation, we've been through a lot these past few weeks in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the tragic killings of other men and women of color. Most of us have reacted with outrage. We've called for real change and meaningful reform. Many of us have joined protest marches and prayer vigils. We hope and pray that change will come and that the senseless violence repeatedly suffered by people of color, each and every one of whom is someone's child, will soon be a thing of the past. But I wonder, is it enough to talk about reforming law enforcement agencies and other social institutions? Or do we need to start even closer to home? Of course, most of us would say that we would never intentionally harm any other human being because of the color of his skin or the shape of her eyes or the language he speaks or the place she's from. But how often do we hurt one another without even realizing what we are doing? I live in a neighborhood where people regularly express shock and horror over violence against others, particularly people of color. Lots of us have signs on our lawns proclaiming that Black Lives Matter or demanding equal justice for all. Perhaps that's what makes it so sad to recent posts on our community listserv. Here are just a few examples. One, written by an African American woman, reads as follows. We arrived here several years ago. Our immediate neighbors were amazing. But when we went to the 4th of July picnic, we were met with stares and rudeness that made me uneasy. I was looking forward to it, but it quickly became one of my saddest memories of living here. When I took my kids for a walk, I soon realized that the people we encountered thought I was the housekeeper. And then, in 2 presidential election years, they constantly asked me about Obama just because I was Black. Another neighbor replied, I'm brown, and I often face similar situations. When we go to the park, people still ask me, how long have you taken care of the family? Still others note, even though I was born here, people often look at my skin and ask me where I'm from. And a friend who is a man of color reports, I've been told several times that only residents can park in the neighborhood, even by people with signs in their lawns supporting progressive causes, sometimes even by other people of color. Implicit bias, microaggression, There are lots of words for the slights and snubs these neighbors describe. Whatever we call them, they add up. 1,000 small cuts that rend hearts and minds as surely as knives and guns tear apart bodies. Subtly, but insidiously, they convey a toxic message, a message that some people just aren't quite the same. They don't belong. Sure, they have roles to play in society, necessary and important roles, but they're not really equal. And when these kinds of messages get magnified millions of times each day in myriad ways across our land, don't they become building blocks of the very systems of racism and injustice we seek so fervently to dismantle? Of course, we need criminal justice and policing reforms. But we think that broken systems are the only hallmarks of the pernicious racism that infuses our society. Aren't we just misleading ourselves? It's a terrible thing to sacrifice a child. But no matter how good our intentions, won't we continue to be complicit in doing just that? And in sacrificing the hopes and dreams and aspirations of all children until we come to terms with the ways in which we all participate in systemic racism? So what can we do? In today's gospel, Jesus calls us to welcome all people in his name. If we're to answer his call, if we're truly to walk the way of love, don't we need to begin by searching our own hearts and reflecting on how we can all do better? Amen.